One of my neighbors said they heard gunshots at 7:30. Why weren't they brought to testify in trial? I just saw that in the clemency report. I never knew that. That person should have been brought to trial to testify. That was something the defense was supposed to do.
What if everything you thought you knew about Frances Newton's case was wrong? What if the first black woman executed in Texas wasn't guilty, and the truth was hidden in a web of lies and questionable evidence? Just 1 hour before she was set to die, the governor of Texas stopped everything, unsure if they were about to execute an innocent woman. But was she truly innocent, or was there something darker at play?
Think about the story you're watching. The pain, the choices, the twists no one saw coming. Now imagine this. What if you had missed it? What if you never knew how it ended? What if you never heard the truth hiding behind it? That's the risk every time you scroll away without subscribing. Because here's the truth. 85% of people who watch these stories never hit that button. They vanish, and so do the stories that could have changed them. But you're still here, and that means something. You've already proven you care about stories that matter. Stories of betrayal, survival, justice, and redemption. Stories that don't just entertain you, but stay with you. Stories that make you think about life, about people, about yourself. And here's the thing, we're only just beginning. The next story, it's darker, it's deeper, and it carries a twist you won't see coming. The kind of story people will talk about for years, but you'll only catch it if you're here when it drops. So I'm asking you, right now, before you go, don't just watch. Be part of this. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because this isn't just a channel. It's a journey through the untold, the forgotten, and the unbelievable. And the people who stay, who subscribe, are the ones who never miss a single heartbeat of the truth. Remember, the difference between knowing how the story ends and being left behind is just one click. So, will you let the next story slip away? Or will you make sure you're here, front row, when the next twist drops? The choice is yours. But if you felt something in this story, if it stayed with you, then you already know the answer. Subscribe now. Be part of the story. Because the next chapter begins soon, and you'll want to be here when it does.
What if everything you thought you knew about Frances Newton's past was a lie? What if her troubled life wasn't the cause of her downfall, but the result of something much darker? It's easy to label someone like Frances Newton as just another victim of a broken system. Her life was filled with struggles, from financial hardships to a family riddled with dysfunction. But what if there was more to her story, a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered? What if those early struggles weren't just part of her environment, but clues to something far more sinister? Something that set the stage for the tragic events that would unfold years later. Born into a world of instability, Frances's childhood was far from easy. Raised in a family with its own share of problems, she quickly learned that life could be unpredictable, harsh, and unforgiving. Her family background didn't offer the stability and love most children expect. Her mother, who struggled to keep the family afloat, and her father, who was often absent, left Frances to fend for herself emotionally. This lack of support would shape her into someone who felt isolated and desperate for a sense of control. From an early age, Frances was exposed to financial strain and a lack of emotional support. Imagine growing up in a world where love felt conditional and survival was a day-to-day struggle. Frances's mother worked tirelessly, but their circumstances never seemed to improve. The harshness of life left her feeling like an outsider in her own home. With little guidance, she turned inward, developing a mistrust of others and a hardened resolve to make her own way, no matter the cost.
This growing sense of self-reliance and fear of vulnerability left a mark on Frances, leading her to seek out relationships that could provide her with something she desperately craved: stability. However, the very people she turned to for comfort were often just as flawed as the life she tried to escape. These toxic relationships, whether with her family members or romantic partners, only deepened the emotional void she was trying to fill. The childhood neglect and emotional trauma she endured couldn't be overlooked. The lack of affection from her parents left her feeling unloved, and the financial instability she experienced taught her that money was more than just a means to survive. It was a lifeline, something she would come to crave. This need for control over her own future and financial security would, in time, become a significant factor in the decisions she would make, for better or for worse. By the time Frances reached adulthood, she had a deep-seated fear of failure, a constant anxiety that would push her into making decisions that would change her life forever. She didn't see her financial struggles and family dysfunction as isolated issues, but as a pattern, a reality she had to break free from at any cost. As she entered her 20s, the weight of those early experiences continued to follow her, especially as she sought out relationships that promised stability. But in doing so, she found herself in a toxic marriage, a relationship where financial strain and emotional disconnect only pushed her further into a place of desperation.
You might think her troubles were purely the result of a rough childhood, but what if those struggles, the very ones that many would excuse as the root cause of her later actions, were actually the foundation for a much darker side of Frances? What if, deep down, there was something in her from the start, something cold and calculating, waiting to surface? Imagine being a child who feels the weight of the world on their shoulders, a child who grows up in an environment that's supposed to offer love and protection, but instead only offers a cruel lesson in survival. For Frances Newton, the cracks in her life began to show early, especially in her relationship with her parents. Her mother, a woman who worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, was absent in the ways that mattered most. Her father, meanwhile, was either distant or emotionally unavailable. In this environment, Frances learned that trust and affection weren't guarantees, but things you had to fight for, and even then, they weren't always forthcoming. Her family dynamic, fractured by emotional neglect and financial struggle, shaped how she saw the world. She was often left to navigate life on her own, without the emotional guidance or support that so many children rely on. As the years passed, this absence of love and security turned into something much more toxic. Frances began to feel like an outsider, trapped in a cycle of needing affection but never quite finding it. The financial struggles only added to the burden, reinforcing the idea that if she was going to survive, she had to fend for herself emotionally and financially.
But what if these very struggles weren't just a backdrop to her life, but the fuel that ignited a much darker need for control? Could a person so desperate to break free from emotional neglect and financial ruin eventually take actions that would haunt them forever? As Frances moved into adulthood, the weight of her childhood became more than just a series of bad memories. It became a force that shaped her every decision. The foundation of dishonesty and survival instinct that had been instilled in her as a child began to show its darker side. Frances found herself embroiled in criminal activity, starting with forgery. At first glance, one might think of it as a mere lapse in judgment, a desperate attempt to fix a financial hole. But what if it was more than that? What if forgery was just one piece of a much larger pattern, an ongoing attempt to take control of a life that had always felt out of her hands?
The act of forging documents wasn't just about money. It was a manifestation of Frances's desperate desire to break free from the confines of her environment, to create her own path, even if it meant stepping into the shadows. It was a signal that she was willing to cross lines that others wouldn't even consider. As the days passed, dishonesty became more than a tool for survival. It became her default mode, an instinctual response to a life that had taught her that only by lying, manipulating, or bending the rules could she get what she wanted. But the cracks didn't just appear in her financial dealings. They began to show in her relationships as well. The person she married, Adrian Newton, wasn't a Prince Charming, but rather another manifestation of her desperate need for stability, someone she hoped would fill the emotional void left by her parents. Their marriage, however, was strained. Tension replaced tenderness, and discontent seeped into their interactions, just as it had with her family. She had hoped that love would heal her broken past, but instead it only seemed to amplify her fears and desires to control. As the marriage faltered, she found herself turning to other men for attention and validation, seeking in them what she could never find in her husband. This constant pattern of seeking control through others, through her finances, her relationships, her actions, wasn't just about surviving. It was about asserting herself in a world that had never let her feel in charge. But how far could she push these boundaries before the consequences became too dire? Could all these circumstances really lead someone to commit such an atrocity? Or was there something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface of a broken life? You see, Frances Newton wasn't simply a product of a broken past, but a woman shaped by the shadows of desperation. And as you follow the twists and turns of her story, you'll begin to see that what we perceive as circumstantial may actually be the result of a much deeper, darker drive. A drive that, in the end, would push her to the edge.
Imagine being a child who wakes up every day unsure if anyone is truly there for you. For Frances Newton, this was her reality. The home she was raised in was one where love was not guaranteed. It wasn't the warmth that defined family life, but the coldness of emotional neglect. Her mother, a woman who worked endlessly to make ends meet, was physically present but emotionally absent. And her father, when present, was distant, often leaving Frances to navigate life without the guidance or emotional support a child needs to thrive. This family dysfunction shaped every aspect of her childhood. Security wasn't a promise she could count on. Love was something she had to earn, not something freely given. Frances was forced to grow up far too quickly, often feeling like an outsider in her own home. In a family where emotional connections were rare, she sought validation elsewhere, often from those who were just as emotionally unavailable. The emotional neglect that ran through her early life created an environment where Frances had to fend for herself. She learned that love was conditional. She couldn't rely on her parents, so she started relying on herself. But what does that do to a young child? It makes her build walls, protect herself from hurt, and perhaps, most importantly, start viewing relationships not as sources of support, but as tools to be manipulated for personal gain. As she entered adulthood, these early lessons in emotional neglect became central to her worldview. Frances didn't just want affection, she craved control. Her relationships were never about genuine connection, they were about security. Financial stability, too, became a lifeline. But that need for control led her to more desperate measures. She didn't have the luxury of emotional stability or trust in others.
And without those, her actions began to reveal a woman who wasn't just trying to survive, but to assert dominance over her circumstances.
As Frances's relationships became more toxic, they mirrored the emotional neglect she experienced growing up. She kept seeking affection, but was always let down. Her marriage to Adrian, for example, was a relationship built on shared dysfunction. Financial struggles and emotional isolation only compounded the issues. But even this, she tried to control. The moment she couldn't fix the marriage, she shifted to other men, hoping they'd give her the emotional stability that her father and mother failed to provide. But here's the turning point. Did this emotional neglect shape her actions, or did it simply reveal a more calculating nature that had been lying dormant all along? What if the pain of her upbringing was merely the breeding ground for a darker side of Frances, a side that knew exactly how to exploit her circumstances to get what she wanted? Could this emotional neglect have simply pushed her toward manipulation, or was it a convenient excuse for a more calculated personality? Someone who used her pain to craft a life of control, playing the role of the victim when it suited her. In the end, Frances Newton's life didn't just reflect the consequences of a broken past. It might have been the perfect storm that exposed the darker depths of her personality. And as you continue to learn about her story, you'll see how those early wounds might have been the spark that set her on a path that no one could have predicted.
It was a night that should have been like any other. Frances Newton returned to her apartment, expecting nothing more than the mundane routine of an ordinary evening. But when she walked through that door, everything changed. The life she once knew, her family, her home, the world she had tried to create, was gone in an instant. But that night, everything didn't seem as it appeared. Frances walked into a scene that would send shockwaves through everyone who knew her. Her husband, Adrian, lay dead on the couch, shot through the head. Her son, Alton, barely 7 years old, was in his bed, dead, the result of a bullet to the chest. And in the crib next to him, baby Farah, just 21 months old, was also lifeless, the same fate befalling her. The blood was still fresh, the air heavy with the weight of death. But in that very moment, Frances's reaction was unlike anything anyone would expect. There were no screams, no frantic calls to 911. Instead, Frances stood there, still, her face devoid of the shock and grief you might expect. When Sandra Nelms, her cousin, arrived with her, Frances simply said, "I didn't do this." But in those words was a disturbing calmness, an almost calculated manner that didn't match the horror around her. Frances's behavior that night seemed more like the actions of someone who was already too far removed from the tragedy. It wasn't just the absence of panic that raised suspicion, it was the chain of events leading up to the discovery of the bodies.
Earlier that evening, Frances had made an odd request. She asked her cousin Sandra to come with her to the apartment, but there was no clear explanation as to why. It wasn't just an innocent favor. There was something about that request that felt out of place. Why did she need someone with her? Was she preparing herself for what she knew was coming? But the strangeness didn't end there. Before heading home, Frances took a detour, stopping at an abandoned house next door, an odd, unexplained stop. She left the car with a blue canvas bag, something that didn't seem out of the ordinary at first glance, but what was inside would soon raise the stakes of the investigation. She went inside the house, concealed the bag, and then returned to the apartment as if nothing had happened. But inside that bag was the weapon that would tie her to the murder, a .25 caliber Raven Arms pistol, later confirmed to be the murder weapon. When the authorities arrived and began investigating, this blue bag became a critical piece of evidence. But Frances, calm, controlled, seemingly detached from the horror she had just witnessed, had already told a story that didn't quite match up with the facts. She continued to deny any involvement, claiming that her husband's death was the result of a drug debt owed to a mysterious figure named Charlie. Yet when detectives searched for this alleged drug dealer, nothing turned up. No evidence of a man named Charlie, and no evidence that Adrian had any real ties to drugs. Every moment, every detail seemed to lead back to one central question. Why was she so calm? Was this a woman in shock, unable to process the grief of losing her family? Or was this the reaction of someone who already knew the outcome of their actions? Someone who was hiding more than just her grief.
The quiet detachment in the face of horror began to look less like the reaction of an innocent woman and more like the behavior of someone who had been anticipating this very moment. She had hidden the weapon. She had taken her time. And in that moment, with the bodies of her family members surrounding her, she stood there, eerily composed, as if waiting for the inevitable to unfold. How would you feel if, after finding your family murdered, your first words were, "I didn't do this"? The scene was beyond comprehension. A mother, a wife, standing in the doorway of her apartment, staring at the lifeless bodies of her family. Adrian, her husband, lying dead with a bullet wound to the head. Her children, Alton and Farah, two innocent lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The air was thick with grief, yet Frances's response wasn't what anyone might expect. Her voice was calm, almost mechanical, as she muttered, "I didn't do this." In that moment, her response didn't feel like a natural reaction to such tragedy. Was it shock? Denial? Or was it something else entirely? Could this detachment, the absence of tears, the lack of frantic panic, be a sign of someone trying to conceal their guilt under the guise of innocence? Or was it simply a woman so emotionally numb from years of unrelenting turmoil that her very sense of reality had shattered? The events leading up to that night were filled with signs of tension, of a woman on the brink. Frances was suffocating. The walls of her life, once narrow and cramped with emotional strain and financial stress, were closing in on her, and she felt trapped. Her marriage to Adrian had always been strained, but in recent months, it had become downright suffocating. Jealousy had infected her every thought, as Adrian's affairs were no longer the silent whispers in the background of their marriage. They were in her face, undeniable. He no longer hid his relationships with other women, and Frances found herself spiraling, her emotions raw and unforgiving. But it wasn't just infidelity that destroyed her. It was the loss of control. Adrian's lack of commitment to their marriage left Frances feeling vulnerable. Her desire for financial stability clashed with the realities of their mounting debt, the poverty that threatened to swallow them both. Every day was a new reminder of her failure to escape her circumstances. She had no power, not over her relationship, not over her finances, and certainly not over her emotional state. That powerlessness gnawed at her, driving her deeper into desperation. But the money, the life insurance policies, that was the only thing that gave her a sense of control. The policies were a plan, a desperate attempt to secure her future, to escape a life she no longer could stand. She had taken out 3 policies, one on herself, one on Adrian, and one on their daughter, Farah. The desire for financial relief became intertwined with a desire for control. But control over what? Was she simply trying to build a life where she was no longer dependent on Adrian, no longer financially suffocated? Or was this a calculated move to finally break free at any cost? And then came that moment. The moment when she realized that nothing in her life would change unless she took matters into her own hands. Frances knew the end was inevitable, but it was in the heat of this desperate realization that she saw the only way out. Eliminate the source of her suffocating reality, Adrian. Was she just another victim of a broken marriage? Was her emotional pain so overwhelming, the lack of love so suffocating, that she simply couldn't see a way forward? Or did her desperation for control, for freedom from the prison of her life, ultimately push her to make a choice so unspeakable that it would destroy her entire world? The blue bag. She had hidden it, just as she had hidden the secrets of her emotions for so long. What was inside wasn't just a weapon, it was her only chance at escape, a desperate attempt to take control over a life that had been slipping through her fingers. The gun wasn't just a tool for murder, it was a symbol of everything she could never control in her life: the power to choose her future, the power to escape. As the realization settled in, the emotional turmoil was evident. Frances was trapped between guilt and justification. Was she the victim of circumstances, or was she, in fact, the architect of her own fate, a woman who used her suffering as a reason to take the ultimate step? Frances's marriage to Adrian wasn't just breaking down, it was suffocating her. Every day she felt more invisible, more overlooked, and more powerless. The cracks in their relationship had been there for years, but they had widened beyond repair. Adrian's infidelity wasn't a surprise, it was a confirmation of what she had felt for a long time. He had checked out long ago. He wasn't just cheating, he was emotionally absent, leaving her alone to fend for herself, to manage everything from finances to the emotional wreckage of their home.
But what truly hurt wasn't the betrayal, it was that Frances could never regain control. Adrian had the power to hurt her, to dismiss her, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Her jealousy, the anger she felt when she saw Adrian with another woman, wasn't just about him. It was about how he controlled the narrative of their lives. She had spent so long trying to keep everything together, but it felt like he had made his decision. She was no longer his priority, and he was slipping further away. This wasn't just the crumbling of a marriage, this was the crushing weight of a woman who had given everything, emotionally, financially, physically, and was left with nothing but emptiness. Her sense of self-worth had been chipped away, piece by piece, as Adrian drifted further into his own world. He wasn't the man she had married. He had become a stranger, and Frances felt trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape. But more than the betrayal, it was the financial pressure that drove Frances to the edge. The mounting debt, the constant fear of losing everything, and the overwhelming sense of desperation to secure her future without Adrian. These were the driving forces that gnawed at her day and night. She had tried everything to fix her situation. The life insurance policies had been a calculated decision, a way to gain control over a life that seemed to be spiraling out of control. $50,000 per policy, one for Adrian, one for herself, one for Farah. In the grand scheme of things, that money seemed like the only way out, the only way to break free from the chains of emotional and financial instability. But that money wasn't just an escape. It was the final step in Frances's decision to take control in a life where she felt powerless. She didn't want to be stuck in a broken marriage. She didn't want to be dependent on someone who couldn't care less about her. But in the moment that she took the step to end it all, did she see the cost? What is the true cost of desperation? Was it the cost of finally asserting control, or was it the price she had to pay for freedom from a suffocating life?
Frances's choice wasn't made in a moment of blind rage, nor was it an act driven purely by passion. It was a decision born of months, if not years, of frustration. The more Adrian withdrew, the more Frances felt that the noose around her neck was tightening.
She couldn't breathe in her marriage, and she couldn't breathe under the financial burden either. What would you do if you woke up every day feeling like your world was slipping away? Would you keep trying to fix it, or would you make the desperate choice to take everything into your own hands? Was this really a crime of passion, or was it a calculated act, born of a woman who had been pushed to the edge by the weight of a failing marriage and mounting pressures she could no longer control? In the end, it wasn't just the final act of violence that sealed the fate of her family. It was a culmination of all the years of desperation, of feeling powerless, of seeing no way out except through the destruction of the life she had tried to make.
You've been following this story closely, and by now, you've seen the turmoil, the manipulation, and the heartache that led to this unimaginable crime. But here's the thing. Many people watch these stories thinking, "That's not me. I'd never make that choice." But what if you were in their shoes? What if you faced the same pressures, the same emotional battle, the same desperation? Frances didn't wake up one morning and decide to end her family's life. It wasn't a simple decision. It was a build-up, years of suffering, and a final moment of pure desperation. And yet, for every person who tells themselves they'd never do it, there's someone else, someone like Frances, who feels like they have no choice but to act. So ask yourself, could it be that in the right circumstances, you too might make the unthinkable choice? If you care about stories like these, about the dark corners of the human mind, you can't afford to miss what happens next. Don't turn away from the truth, because if you do, you might just be ignoring the very thing that could change your perspective forever. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because the next chapter of this story could be even more unsettling than you ever imagined. Don't miss it.
What if the evidence you've been shown isn't the whole truth? What if key pieces of the puzzle have been misinterpreted, overlooked, or even distorted to fit a narrative? From the moment Frances Newton was arrested, the case seemed straightforward: a woman who killed her husband and children for money. The evidence appeared to be clear-cut: the ballistics, the gunshot residue, and the blue bag containing the murder weapon. But as the investigation deepened, questions started to surface. Questions that threatened to unravel everything we thought we knew about the case. Could the investigation have missed something crucial? Was the evidence as solid as it seemed? Let's start with the ballistics, the critical piece of evidence linking the murder weapon to the victims. At first glance, the .25 caliber Raven Arms pistol found in the blue bag seemed to seal the deal. It was the gun that matched the bullets recovered from Adrian and the children's bodies. But ballistics experts weren't so sure. There were issues with the testing procedures, questions about whether the gun was properly examined, and whether the shell casings found at the scene actually matched the gun. How could such critical evidence be so ambiguous? If the ballistics didn't match perfectly, could this weapon actually be the one used to kill the family, or was it planted? Were investigators so eager to solve the case that they overlooked critical details? Then, there's the gunshot residue, GSR, found on Frances's clothes, specifically around the waistline of her skirt. This seemed like an open and shut case. A mother covered in GSR, clearly linking her to the shooting. But there's a flaw in this reasoning. GSR can transfer in multiple ways, and some experts argued that Frances could have come into contact with the residue without firing the gun. Perhaps she simply touched the weapon, or was near the gun when it was fired, but that doesn't necessarily make her the one who pulled the trigger. Could this residue be an indication of involvement, or was it circumstantial, merely adding to an image of guilt rather than proving it beyond a reasonable doubt? And then there's the blue bag, the object that would come to symbolize the entire investigation. When Frances showed up with that blue bag, it seemed like the ultimate piece of evidence, the weapon that killed Adrian and the children, hidden away in the bag, out of sight.
But what if the presence of the bag didn't tell the whole story? What if it was planted? How could someone so seemingly detached from the crime, someone who might have been guilty but appeared oddly calm, also be so careless as to leave the weapon in plain view? Was this an act of negligence? Or was the weapon placed there by someone trying to frame her? This question lingered in the investigation, with no definitive answer in sight. As each piece of evidence was scrutinized, doubts began to grow. Was the case against Frances based on assumptions? On a narrative that investigators were too eager to confirm? Or was the evidence really as conclusive as it seemed? With all the inconsistencies and potential errors, could Frances really be guilty? Or was she caught in a web of misinterpreted facts and incomplete conclusions? The more you look at the evidence, the more you start to ask, how could such a clear-cut case have so many holes? If the ballistics didn't align perfectly, if the gunshot residue was inconclusive, and if the blue bag might not even have been Frances's doing, where does that leave the truth? What if the investigators were too quick to close the case, too eager to blame Frances when they should have been questioning whether the evidence pointed to the right person at all? What if everything you thought you knew about Frances's involvement in this crime wasn't what it seemed? What if the woman sitting before the detectives was playing a role, one so convincing, so calculated, that it would make even the most seasoned investigator question everything they knew about her?
When the interrogation began, Frances Newton was calm. Almost too calm. The detectives expected panic, guilt, a woman crushed by the weight of what she had done. Instead, they were met with a woman who seemed almost detached from the horror that had unfolded in her own home. There was no frantic sobbing, no desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. Just a woman who answered every question with an unnervingly composed tone. "I didn't do this," she repeated, almost mechanically. But beneath this veneer of control, something felt wrong. Was she truly in shock? Or was this detachment the result of a mind trying to protect itself from the consequences of a horrific choice? Her refusal to react emotionally to the murder of her own family only added to the unease. Was it the behavior of an innocent woman struggling to process the unspeakable? Or was it a calculated defense mechanism designed to conceal guilt? The more the detectives pressed, the more inconsistencies emerged. Frances's conflicting statements revealed cracks in her story, suggesting that she wasn't simply confused, she was deflecting, weaving a narrative to escape accountability. At one point, she pointed to a mysterious figure, Charlie, a supposed drug dealer who she claimed was responsible for the deaths of her family. "It wasn't me," she insisted, almost too quickly. "It was Charlie. He was the one with the gun."
But when the detectives dug deeper, they found no trace of this mysterious figure. Charlie didn't exist in any of the known records. No one by that name had any connection to Adrian or Frances. Could it be that Frances was simply grasping at straws, trying to shift the blame onto someone who was never meant to be found? Or was this the final piece of her elaborate defense, a carefully spun web of lies designed to keep her from facing the truth of her own actions? As the hours dragged on, Frances's ability to maintain her composure began to slip. She grew increasingly defensive with every new challenge to her narrative. Her voice, once steady, now wavered slightly when confronted with details that didn't align with her version of events. Her face remained impassive, but her words started to reveal the cracks in her story. It was in those moments, when the lies piled up, that the tension in the room became unbearable. The detectives could feel it. Frances was unraveling. She wasn't just a woman in shock, she was a woman fighting for her freedom, her mind desperately working to keep her trapped in a web of self-preservation. But the more she spoke,
the more her inconsistencies were laid bare. The further she tried to escape the truth, the tighter the investigators' grip became. Was she really a victim of a failed marriage, an innocent woman crushed by the weight of a tragic situation beyond her control? Or had she calculated every step, using her story, her tears, and her lies to manipulate everyone around her, including the detectives themselves? What's the true cost of desperation when a woman is backed into a corner, knowing that the only way out is through deception? Frances's calm demeanor seemed less like shock and more like a woman desperately fighting to hold on to control even when everything else was slipping away. Was this really a crime of passion? An explosive act driven by years of pent-up frustration and betrayal? Or was it the calculated choice of someone who felt trapped and had chosen murder as a way to seize control of her life once again?
What if the execution of Frances Newton didn't just leave questions unanswered, but left behind a bitter taste in the mouths of everyone who thought justice was served? On the evening of September 14, 2005, the air was thick with tension, not only because the world was about to witness the execution of Frances Newton, but because, for many, it was a final, uncomfortable resolution that brought no sense of peace, only more questions. For Frances's family, the night was both a final act of finality and a devastating realization. Sitting in the visitors' gallery of the prison, her parents, her mother in particular, had to confront the gut-wrenching truth. Their daughter was about to be killed by the state. For years, they had stood by her, even when the evidence seemed to point to her guilt. They had seen her grow from a bright-eyed child into a woman who seemed unable to escape the consequences of her own choices. But now, as they watched her face death, how did they reconcile the love they had for the girl they once knew with the woman who would soon be put to death by the very system that promised to uphold justice? Was their daughter a victim of circumstances? A woman who had been pushed beyond the brink of despair by years of emotional neglect and financial struggle? Or had she become the very thing they feared? A woman who took the lives of her own family out of calculation and desperation. Her mother's face, tired and streaked with tears, held a mix of guilt and grief. Was it the regret of not being able to save her daughter? Or was it the deep, soul-crushing realization that the person standing in front of them had become something unrecognizable? As the hours ticked down, Frances's parents, particularly her mother, found themselves trapped between the emotions of loss and the anguish of the truth they could not escape. Outside the prison, the community's reaction was no less divided. Protests erupted from activists and abolitionists who felt the death penalty was a relic of an unjust past, a system that took lives but never fully healed the wounds it left behind. On the other hand, there were those who felt relief, even satisfaction, in the belief that justice had been served, that Frances Newton, after 17 years on death row, had finally paid the price for her crime. For them, it was not just about the loss of a family, but about the restoration of order. Adrian, Alton, and Farah's deaths were tragic, but there was an overwhelming sense in these communities that Frances's execution was the only way to close the chapter on such a horrific tragedy.
The divide in the community went beyond politics. It was about something far more personal. What is true justice? Is it the legal punishment that the system promises, or is it a sense of peace, of emotional closure that comes from knowing the loss has been righted? As Frances's final moments approached, those on either side of the debate were left to ask themselves, did the execution bring justice, or did it just force them to reckon with the complexities of a broken system? Frances's last words were simple: "I am innocent." It wasn't the plea of a broken woman asking for mercy, it was a defiant statement, one that suggested she would never accept the reality of what she had done. Was she simply clinging to the only thing she could control in her final moments, the narrative of her innocence? Or was there something more profound in her statement,
a belief that her death was the result of an unjust system, a miscarriage of justice that no amount of remorse could change. At 6:23 p.m., after receiving the lethal injection, Frances Newton was pronounced dead. The community, her family, and the world were left to process the emotional aftermath, each person experiencing it in their own way, with anger, sadness, and the deep, gnawing feeling that the truth of Frances's life may never be fully known. As Frances was laid to rest, the question remained, did anyone truly get the justice they thought they were owed? Or had the execution of Frances Newton simply been a reminder of a system that could never heal the wounds it inflicted?
What if the execution of Frances Newton didn't just leave questions unanswered, but left behind a bitter taste in the mouths of everyone who thought justice was served? September 14th, 2005. As the time for Frances Newton's execution drew closer, emotions ran high, not just within the prison walls, but across the entire state of Texas. For years, her case had been a source of public debate and moral conflict, but as the moment of her death approached, the tension shifted from legal debate to personal reflection. Would this finally bring justice to the victims, or would it leave behind an even deeper sense of unresolved questions, echoing far beyond the courtroom? For Frances's family, the reality of her execution was a gut-wrenching culmination of a life filled with pain, love, and doubt. Her parents, in particular, had spent years on the sidelines fighting for her, but always haunted by the growing gap between the young girl they raised and the woman who was now facing death. Their emotions were torn between love and loss, and their presence at the execution was not an act of closure, but an agonizing acknowledgement that they could not save her. As they sat in the visitation room, their hearts heavy with grief, what were they thinking? Was it possible to reconcile the daughter they once knew with the woman who had been condemned? They had watched her grow up, witnessed her unravel, and yet in the final moments of her life, there was a devastating realization they had failed her. Could love ever be enough to make up for the fatal choices she made? Or were they left in that room to bear witness to a final sentence they never imagined would come to this?
But for Frances herself, the execution was not a moment of emotional release. It was a cold, final step into the unknown. Her silence in the last moment spoke louder than any words could have. In those final seconds, she chose not to speak, not to beg, not to make any last appeal for mercy. The lack of last words felt like an echoing absence, an absence that left more questions than answers. Was this silence a defiant statement, a refusal to accept the guilt imposed upon her? Was it the silence of someone who had already made peace with the inevitable, knowing that nothing could undo the past? Or was it the silent resignation of a woman who, after 17 years on death row, had simply become numb to the reality of what was about to happen? Her final moments were a study in contradiction. She had never fully confessed to the crime, yet she never denied her role either. Was she a woman who truly believed in her own innocence? Or was she someone who had become so entangled in years of denial that she couldn't face the truth? The more she remained silent, the more the moral questions about her guilt and innocence lingered in the air. Had we all failed to fully examine the evidence, to consider the uncertainties before finally pulling the trigger? Outside the prison, the reaction was a microcosm of society's moral battle. Protests erupted. Human rights groups, activists, and concerned citizens gathered to decry the death penalty. They didn't just protest the execution of a woman, they protested the system itself, one that allowed a woman to spend 17 years on death row under questionable circumstances, one that couldn't give clear answers about Frances's actual guilt. Was this justice? Or was it simply the state-sanctioned killing of a person who might have been wronged by the system in ways we couldn't fully understand? And then, on the other side of the debate,
There were those who saw no need for protest, those who felt justice had been served. For them, the death penalty was a matter of finality, the closure they believed was necessary for the victims' families and for society at large.
To them, Frances's death was a conclusion, a painful but necessary step to bring an end to the horrific crime she committed. In their eyes, the questions about evidence were secondary to the retribution they believed was deserved. But even after the lethal injection was administered and Frances's life was extinguished at 6:23 p.m., the emotional residue left by the case remained. Was it truly justice? Or was it a system that had become too comfortable with finality, too quick to erase lives without fully confronting the complexity of truth? Frances's execution did not bring the closure many had hoped for. It didn't settle the moral debates surrounding the death penalty, nor did it silence the questions about her guilt. If we had waited longer, would we have found the truth? Or was the truth lost in a sea of uncertainty, overshadowed by the desire to move on? Was Frances Newton a victim of circumstance, someone whose actions were driven by brokenness, desperation, and a system that failed her? Or was she a cold-blooded killer, someone who took the lives of her family with calculation and malice? And more importantly, what does this case really say about justice and the system that delivered it? Is justice truly blind? Or does it too suffer from the flaws of the society it serves?
You've been with us through this entire journey. The twists, the questions, the emotional unraveling. But here's the thing. Many people watched thinking, that's someone else's story. That's not my problem. But what if it was your story? What if it was someone you loved, sitting on death row, fighting for a second chance, while the world around them quickly moved to judgment? What if you turned away now without considering the true complexity of this case? What if you never heard the full story? What if you didn't see the truth buried beneath the surface? The truth is, 85% of people who come this far never hit that subscribe button. They watch, they think, and then they vanish, leaving behind the unresolved, the uncomfortable, the questions that need to be asked. But you're still here. You've already proven you care enough to question the system, to wonder what could have been different, to seek out the stories that aren't as simple as they first seem. And because you're here, you know that the next chapter isn't just another story. It's the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about justice. So I'm asking you, don't let the next twist slip away. Don't let these questions remain unanswered. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because when the next story drops, it might just be the one that changes everything. You're still here. So make sure you're here for the next chapter, because when the truth finally comes to light, it's those who stayed who'll never be left behind.